My name is Richard Sigurdsson. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Arts, and it's an enormous privilege for me to welcome you here today for the Dr. Frank Anton Distinguished Lecture Series in Economics. I'd like first to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot and other Treaty 7 peoples, including the Siksika, Piikani, Kainai, Tsuut'ina, and Stoney Nakoda First Nations. We are also home here in Calgary to the Métis Nation of Southern Alberta, Region 3. Well, this is always a tremendous honor, and it's always a lot of fun to come to this lecture. I think I would say that all of us in other departments in the Faculty of Arts are envious that on a Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock, you can have 300 undergraduate students show up for a talk. And that really is a credit to all of you students and to what a wonderful department this is, a wonderful department of economics. This lecture series has been going on for a while now as a distinguished lecture series. And in many ways, this speaks particularly to what are now our eyes-high strategic goals for this university, to be a top research university that is innovative in teaching and learning and is really reaching out to the communities that we both lead and serve. And this is an event open to everyone, but really it's focused on the student experience. And as we revitalized the Eyes High strategic plan just this past year, along with our traditional 3 pillars, we've added a special emphasis on the undergraduate student experience. We really wanted to make University of Calgary a leading research institution for our undergraduate students. And this is a perfect example of that, that we have a lecture series that is designed particularly for undergraduate students. And so it's pitched traditionally for undergraduates in economics, which means that, of course, it's pitched higher than me, and I will struggle along as I always do. But I find these lectures particularly interesting and important. We get to bring some of the best economists in the whole world here to Calgary to speak to undergraduate students and community members who attend. So this is a fabulous, fabulous opportunity for all of us. And it's particularly exciting these last couple of years because the Distinguished Lecture Series has now been named after the first department head of the department here of economics, Frank Anton. And I'm not going to be able to go through his whole life story, but what a fascinating individual Frank Anton was. He was born in 1920 in Ireland. As a young man, he joined the RAF and flew in the war, was shot down over Nuremberg in 1943, spent 2 years in a prisoner of war camp, also survived a 40-day forced march in advance of the Soviet army, and made his way back to England. Well, as it turns out, when he got back to England, he had during his time in the prisoner of war camp, found a love, and that is economics. Apparently, of the few books that were available in this prisoner of war camp, was a trove of books on economics. And so he read through all these again and again and again and essentially taught himself economics in the prisoner of war camp. Without the kind of proper training you would normally have to get into the London School of Economics, he challenged admission to the London School of Economics, got in, got a degree, ended up moving to Canada, ended up eventually getting a PhD from the London School of Economics, went various places in Canada and was in the States for a while, was on faculty at at the University of Alberta, and here in Calgary it was as you know, at that time, in the early 60s, before the University of Calgary became what it is now, there was teaching of economics here, but when the new university was founded, it needed a department head for economics. And Frank Anton, and the story that I always hear is that, well, Frank Anton was the only bachelor on faculty in the Department of Economics in Edmonton at the time, and so it was felt that, well, he can go. He doesn't have to move his family all the way down to this cow town. So Frank Anton came, and the wonderful edifice that you have of the Department of Economics with leading researchers like Dr. Scott Taylor, who I'm going to introduce in a minute, all of this was built with the foundations laid by Dr. Frank Anton. And then more than that, after a tremendous career and a wonderful retirement, in Frank Anton's will, he left as a legacy money to the London School of Economics and money to the Department of Economics here in order to, among other things, provide scholarships for students, but also we ended up endowing this lecture series so it will be able to go on in perpetuity under his name. So I have said to the department heads, and now Dr. Rob Oxaby needs to realize that Frank Anton has set the bar for legacy gifts. It's $1 million, and we expect that now from each of our department heads. So this is a tremendous occasion. We're so glad that you've all been here, all been able to come here. We're delighted to have one of the world's best economists in Dr. Staiger. And to introduce our speaker, I'd like to turn it over to your own Dr. Scott Taylor.
Hello, thanks for coming. I thought the weather was too good for this crowd, so I closed the doors immediately. I'm Scott Taylor. I'm a professor in the Department of Economics, and since all of you came, I'll admit I'm the organizer of the event. I think today we're going to have a very interesting lecture, partly because of our friend Donald Trump, but mostly because of Professor Staiger, who we're delighted to have here. Now, I've known Professor Staiger, or Bob to me, for quite a long time. And in introducing him today, I thought there were 3 things that you should know about Bob. First, he's an excellent academic. He's held tenured appointments at Stanford, at the University of Wisconsin, back at Stanford again, back at Wisconsin again, and now at Dartmouth. So Bob is really good at getting tenure at top US departments. Not once, but many times. In fact, the 5 jobs I listed are only the offers that Bob took, and there's probably at least another 10 tenured offers from top departments that Bob has refused over the years, places like Chicago, Columbia, and NYU. Now, the reason why Bob finds it so easy to move is that his work is just so good. Honestly, without a doubt, he is the world's leading expert on the economics of the world trading system and the how and why of the GATT and the WTO. So after the lecture today, we're going to have, not quite open mics, but pretty close to that, and hopefully you'll have a chance to ask questions that are on the top of your mind. Now, secondly, Bob isn't just an academic. He is also deeply involved in the policy process, albeit he's not responsible in any way for anything that's recently occurred in the United States. Now, he was a senior staff economist at the Council of Economic Advisors to the President, where he worked in the White House and helped formulate trade policy. He's also worked very closely with lawyers and political scientists on WTO dispute settlement, and he continues to help the WTO research department. So yes, Bob is a great academic, but he's also firmly grounded in the real nitty-gritty of trade policy. Third and finally, Bob is a fantastic teacher and supervisor. He's won several teaching awards, and he is perhaps the most successful graduate supervisor in the field of international economics. He's supervised over 30 PhD students during his career, with 10 of these obtaining tenure-track appointments at very prestigious places like Columbia, Princeton, Yale, and Penn. Although Penn has kind of slipped because you know who went there. The very first woman economist to be the editor of the leading journal in our profession, the American Economic Review, was Bob's student. The current host of Trade Talks, a podcast by The Economist, available on iTunes, is Bob's student. The current editor of the leading flagship journal in international economics is Bob's student. It goes on and on and on. If you find anyone successful in the field, there'll be no more than 2 degrees of separation between them and Bob. So given that this event is for students, it's fitting that we choose someone who has spent so much of his life helping students, achieving their goals, and is so good at it. And that's Bob. And it's also fitting, given today's concerns over the ongoing NAFTA renegotiation, that we choose a trade policy expert. Again, that's Bob. So for all these reasons, I'd like you to help me warmly welcome Professor Robert Staiger.
All right, thank you, Scott, for that warm introduction, and maybe this is a little loud, I don't know, maybe somebody can adjust it. In any case, I'm very pleased to be here. It's a real privilege to give this lecture, and I too am really happy to see a big turnout because I think this is a topic that is fascinating both at an academic level, but also at just a public policy and a citizen level for all of us to be thinking about the issues that are confronting us in the global trading system. And I have to say that, given what's gone on in the US over the last week, there would have to be something seriously wrong with me if I couldn't draw a crowd with a title like this, but I am glad to see that people have showed up. Okay, so the talk is multilateralism dead? Trade in the era of Trump. And what I'm going to do is kind of talk through the issues as I see them. And part of what I'm doing, and probably all of you are doing, given this past week, is as a talk in a university, an academic setting where we're students and faculty try to get a little bit away from the headlines, even though we can't completely, and I'm going to be linking to the headlines, but I'm going to try to kind of push some themes that are a little bit beyond the headlines in the hope of helping us make sense of what's going on. So to begin, individuals, of course, are the ultimate drivers of globalization, but governments set the rules of the game, and those rules can be really important to the outcome. Now, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, which if you didn't know about before this week, we all are reading about it in the papers every day, and the GATT before it, the GATT was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was created in 1947. The WTO took over for the GATT in 1995. The WTO is a place where governments come to agree on the rules of globalization. And importantly, and kind of emphasize, as I'll try to talk through in my talk, those rules are both the multilateral rules that apply to all the 164 current members of the WTO, member countries, and also the preferential trade agreements that they negotiate, like NAFTA, that Canada and US and Mexico are members of. What do those rules do? Why do countries have to get together in Geneva or wherever and negotiate the rules? Well, they basically solve the problems that would arise absent the rules and under the law of the jungle. And of course, that's kind of a tautology. Hopefully, that's what they must do. But academics have been actually struggling to say, what actually do these trade agreements do, and why should they have a legitimacy in the world? Well, whatever that legitimacy is, and I'm going to try to emphasize that in this talk, the WTO rules basically define the constitution of the global trade order today. And the GATT-WTO is what I would call a member-driven organization that's been traditionally about what I would define as shallow integration. So what do I mean by member-driven? Well, it's basically an agreement where the countries are seeking mutually advantageous trade liberalization as judged by the member governments. So the governments are coming together, and the hope is that they can all agree to something that they all benefit from. And that something should be trade liberalization. That is pretty clear. But it's member-driven in the sense that the WTO is not an institution that would typically say to countries, you should have free trade. It is more what countries want to negotiate. Secondly, the shallow integration part is that the WTO and GATT before it focused on tariffs and other trade impediments imposed at the border, like quotas, and really left at the door a lot of the domestic policies that we might imagine and that are in the headlines today, domestic regulations and other things that one might want to negotiate. Okay, but I think the ground is really shifting under the WTO. And a good example of that is the Doha round, the most recent multilateral round of negotiations in the WTO. Started in 2001. It's actually the first multilateral round initiated by the WTO. Before that, the GATT had all the multilateral rounds of negotiations, starting from 1947. But the Doha round has disappointed, and in fact, after 16, 17 years, it's suspended. Countries just can't agree on what they want to do at this point. And meanwhile, with the most recent wave of globalization, which I would define as really characterized by two things. First of all, the rise of large emerging economies. So here is a plot from the IMF. It's the GDP share of world GDP of advanced economies, that's the blue line, and emerging and developing economies, that's the orange line. And in 1980, it was about 2/3 of the world's GDP was the advanced industrialized economies, and about 1/3 was the emerging markets. Now, in 2018, it's basically flipped. So the emerging and developing countries have become the dominant economies of the world, and the industrialized countries have fallen to more like 1/3. So that's one big change that has occurred over the last 25, 30 years that I'm going to suggest may be a broader thing that's happening that can help us interpret what's going on in the world today and in the headlines this week. The other defining feature of globalization, I would say, is the rise of offshoring and global supply chains. So it used to be in the mid-1900s and even into the early, maybe 2000s, much of trade was about producing things in my country and then selling them to consumers in another country. With the rise of offshoring and global supply chains, much of trade is now assembling parts and features of a product all over the world and bringing them to some place to assemble those products and then shipping them abroad. So the world has become a global factory in some sense in a way that it wasn't 30 years ago. It's certainly not 50 years ago. And the nature of trade, because that trade is now in all the supply chains and offshoring that occurs, has potentially changed quite dramatically. Well, with those two changes, I think it's fair to say that multilateralism is stumbling, and the ground under the WTO is shifting. And what we're witnessing is really what I would say is a clear evolution from shallow to deep integration. So the deep integration that I would think about would be these acronyms that we all know and love, probably. Some of them are ongoing, some of them are in suspension, but the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, TTIP, your own CETA, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with Europe, the Trans-Pacific Partnership that has now just been voted in by, or agreed to by all the member countries except the US, and to some extent even the WTO has moved toward a much more deep level of integration where countries are beginning to really look into harmonizing their domestic regulations, trying to smooth out regulatory differences across countries so the firms can sell more easily into an expanded unified market. And of course, those things are raising all of the sovereignty issues that we all read about in the papers, and maybe some of us are activists about what is going on with these trade agreements, and are they really doing what we need them to do and not doing more? Okay, and at the same time, of course, there's been a strong backlash to at least some of the dimensions of globalization. First of all, from those who have not shared in the gains. We see across the industrialized countries many segments of population or local regions that have clearly not benefited over the last 30 years of globalization the way other regions and other groups have in industrialized countries. And also, there's the issue of sovereignty. However you want to think about it, whether you think national sovereignty is an outdated thing or a useful thing, it is clear that there are many countries that are whose citizens are reeling from some feeling that their sovereignty is being eroded by these international agreements. All right, well, what can we expect from trade in the Trump era with all of that going on? Well, we can certainly expect a lot of Trump trade tweets, we know that. And here's a doozy that you've probably all seen recently. This is from March 2, just a week ago. President Trump said, when a country, USA, is losing many billions of dollars on trade with virtually every country it does business with, trade wars are good and easy to win. Example, when we are down $100 billion with a certain country and they get cute, don't trade anymore. We win big, easy. Okay, so that's a Trump trade tweet. There's many of them, as we all know. But in fact, despite what Trump would undoubtedly like us to believe, I think this is not all about Trump. Okay, I think this is about something much bigger than Trump that's going on. So what am I going to suggest here for the prognosis of multilateralism? Is multilateralism dead? No, I don't think it's dead, but it may be entering a period of hibernation. Do we need a new global trade order? Well, that's harder to say, but as economists in the room and undergraduates who might want to be majoring in economics, I'm going to suggest that economics has a good way of thinking about whether we do need a global trade order revamp and a new change, or whether, in fact, we should be building on the existing order or even keeping it as it is. What we really do need is a diagnosis, right? We need a diagnosis of what the problem is, and we need a nuanced one that really is based on a solid understanding of the problems that we face as a world. And to do that, it's important to understand why GATT worked, the original GATT, even before the WTO, and the economic environment that it's best suited to work in. And then we can ask, are there changes in the economic environment that imply changes for the implied need for changes in the design of the trade agreement? And that's kind of the logic that I want to pursue here, and I want to suggest that economists actually have a way of thinking about this. We don't have all the answers for sure, but it may help you think about this complicated world and put some things into perspective in terms of where we are. Okay, well, the stakes are high. I don't probably need to emphasize that to this group. The future path of globalization looks like we're teetering right now. Is it going to be a multilateral world, or are we going to go into a bunch of trading blocks, or even no trade agreements at all? Which international institutions are going to set the rules of globalization, and what trade-offs are we going to face? Can we continue with a more shallow type of integration that doesn't confront countries with a seemingly stark trade-off between sovereignty and international economic outcomes? Or do we need really to embrace more deep integration and sacrifice the sovereignty that is going to be required? Those are the questions that are at stake. Okay, to answer this is a key starting point that I want to get at, and that is that the WTO's legitimacy, in my view, is not built on the case for free trade. So that's something that, as an economist, you might not think that you would hear me say that, or any economist. But in fact, people who study trade agreements, that is what we think. So it's not the case for free trade that is why economists support the WTO. Rather, the legitimacy is really built on the case for internalizing negative externalities. And that's a very general economic principle that you could apply to environmental agreements or resource agreements or trade agreements. And it has there are many fewer assumptions that are required in order to say, I would like an agreement that would help me internalize the negative externalities in the world. Whereas you might not say, I would like an agreement that is trying to get the world to free trade. There are lots of reasons why you might believe free trade is not the right thing. And a key thing, if you can leave today and believe that, in fact, you should support the WTO, in principle anyway, whether or not you're a free trade supporter, then I've established something that I think is really important for all of us to think about. Okay, now, this is going to take a little work. But you know, you guys got a prime minister who explained quantum computing to you, so I think I can probably explain the economics of trade agreements and get away with it in this group. It's not nearly as complex as quantum computing. All right, so now we're going to start, and we're going to start at the basics. And so let's think about a closed economy where I don't have any trade at all. So we're really starting at the basics, and we're going to get to trade agreements and why we need them. And for this closed economy, I've got the usual Econ 101 supply and demand picture where I've got a price and I've got a quantity. And the A, we could think of it, I don't know, what should we call it? Aluminum? Sure, let's call it aluminum. Okay, so there's the price of aluminum, and there's the quantity of aluminum. If I were a closed economy, I would have a demand curve for aluminum and a supply curve for aluminum. And if the price could move to clear the market, it would clear the market where supply equal demand. So there we are, starting with our simple model of an economy. Okay, it would be really nice to have some welfare measures associated with this industry, in this economy. Then economists have thought of that long ago. We have consumer surplus, which we use to measure the welfare that consumers are getting from their demand. And consumer surplus is just the area under the demand curve above the price. So remember that. That's just our measure of welfare for consumers. On the other hand, producers are also getting something. They're getting profits, or what we'll call producer surplus. And the producer surplus is the area above their supply curve and below the price. So this whole amount of shaded stuff is what we would think of as the welfare to producers and consumers that have been generated in this little industry when we have a closed economy. All right, now let's go to the next step. Let's take an open economy, and we'll take a small open economy that is trading at free trade prices. So that's why I have the PAFT here. The aluminum is a free trade price, and I'm going to assume that the price is below the price that would have prevailed in that industry if we closed our borders. And what that means is that as that price drops, well, demand is going to increase for aluminum relative to originally, and supply is going to reduce for aluminum. And there's going to be a difference between demand and supply. Well, that difference is just imports of aluminum. And that's what I've got over on this picture. Still the quantity of aluminum here, but I'm just plotting out the import demand curve. Well, if we had our price all the way up here, I wouldn't import anything. But as the price falls, I start importing more and more as this difference gets bigger and bigger. And here I've got the export supply curve. And that's just because I'm assuming my country is a small price-taking economy. And because of that, there's just a price, and we can import as much aluminum as we want at the going price. So I've got A star is the foreign export supply curve. Okay, it's just a horizontal line. All right, well, what about this economy? Now that we've opened to free trade, I've got consumer surplus, same exact measure as before. It's the area under the demand curve above this new price. And I've got producer surplus. That's the area above the supply curve and below this price, same measure as before. And so when I add up these surplus things, if you think back to what I had before, I've got some new surplus. And that new surplus is exactly what we call the gains from trade. And it's basically what consumers are getting, because there's more consumer surplus than there was before. And that's the extra area relative to the closed economy that my country is getting from free trade. And it turns out that just from the geometry, I can measure that same thing over on this picture. It's just the area under the import demand curve and above the price. All right, you guys don't need to take Scott's international trade course anymore because you've got everything you need to know about international trade. Now let's put a tariff in. Okay, so just suppose that this country says, we're going to announce that we're going to raise the tariff on imported aluminum. What would that do? Well, I'm starting over here. This is like my trade diagram with the imports and export supply. And as I raise the tariff, there's my TA. And it's going to drive a wedge between the price that the exporters are getting at the border and the price inside my market, because the importer is going to have to pay that duty in order to bring it inside. So that duty is going to ultimately be passed on to my domestic citizens. And that's the difference here between the exporter price and my domestic price. Now notice that because this is a small open economy, an implication here, which we'll come back to, is the exporters are not going to eat any of the tariff. They're going to say, you know, if you want to impose a tariff on aluminum, that's fine, but we're not selling you any aluminum unless we get the going price on the world market, because we can sell our aluminum anywhere we want, and you are such a small market that we would never lower our price in order to maintain market share in your market. That's going to be different in a country like the US, as we'll talk about in a minute. But for now, let's just suppose that's true, okay? Well, there's the new price, and now I'm going to go back over here and say, what is that doing inside my economy? Well, it has raised this price above the free trade price, and immediately it's done some stuff. First of all, there's a loss of consumer surplus. Those who were consuming aluminum, so it could be the beer drinking cans, aluminum cans. If you were a beer drinker out of cans as opposed to bottles, you're going to probably pay more for those beers because of the aluminum tariff in the US. So this is the loss of consumer surplus, measured just as before. It's the difference where remember, consumer surplus is the area under the demand curve above the price, but the price moved up to here, so here's the loss of consumer surplus. Well, why would a government do that? It's just hurting its consumers. Well, we have to remember, there is a gain in producer surplus. If I'm an aluminum producer in the US, I am cheering that tariff because my profits have increased. So there is a gain in producer surplus that we might want to think about and say, is that worth it? That's the million-dollar question for the government of this country, is what is the valuation of using a tariff to shift surplus from consumers of aluminum to producers of aluminum? And you can immediately see, just thinking about Trump, that, well, actually, there's a huge debate going on in the US right now. And it's possible that some people might actually say, actually, I would be willing to pay a little bit more for my beer if workers in Kentucky could get rid of their opioid habits and actually be employed, and all sorts of social issues that I think may not have been caused by trade, but giving them a job might actually help them, and they may be able to get some jobs behind this tariff. Now, having said that, I know that's a loaded statement, because what about all the car producers who are also producing cars with aluminum? Those guys may lose jobs. So we have all sorts of issues, but that's the point, is that governments are going to try to value the shifting surplus, and I'm not going to take a stand on how they value it. That's why I'm putting it as purple. Red is bad, green is good, purple is, I don't know. I'm not going to take a stand. Okay, well, we got more here because at the same time, we took some consumer surplus, but we created tariff revenue. That's this little green box here, because the tariff is this amount, say 10% on aluminum, and multiplied by the price, and then by the quantity, that's tariff revenue. And that's a value. If I'm in the US and I'm thinking, man, I would really like Trump to have a big infrastructure program, but I know we've just had this massive tax cut, and I don't know how we're going to pay for it, and we don't want to add to the deficit. Well, I might value that tariff revenue and say, this is partly how we might pay for this infrastructure. Again, I'm not going to take a stand on how the government values converting consumer surplus to tariff revenue. I'm just going to say, yeah, it's a value judgment that each country will have to make in its given circumstances. Okay, final thing is, everyone can agree that this stuff is bad. Deadweight loss, it sounds bad. Anything dead we don't like. Why is it deadweight loss? Because it's loss of consumer surplus, and it is not coming back. There's nothing that I can say, oh, but wait a minute, there's a countervailing thing. That's the bad stuff. And over here, I've just translated all of that stuff into this trade diagram. This here is just these two sums of the red deadweight loss. So that's the cost, and there's the potential benefit of however I'm weighting all these purple stuff. And that's what I've got here. The benefits from redistributing surplus, different governments might feel differently, and the lost gains from trade. Okay, all governments would not like that. All right, well, before we had Trump make his decision and we saw how he made it, I stood by this diagram a little better. Now I have to put my tongue in my cheek a little bit to think that Donald Trump actually is making decisions, at least this decision, in a rational way. But I'm going to stick with my rationality for now and say what most countries do, and I think the US mostly, and maybe we're missing what's going on in the Trump administration, is they make a really careful calculation about their tariffs. There are marginal benefits of higher tariff. So here is the price of aluminum in the US, and there's the free trade price, and as I raise the tariff, I raise the price above, and here's the tariff that I'm going to choose. How would I do that? Well, if you take an Econ 1, you know that anytime you got an exam and they say, where do I go? You just say, you go where marginal benefit equal marginal cost. If I do that, you're going to get 100 on the exam. That's what presidents do. Well, maybe not all presidents, but most presidents will take a very difficult calculation and say, I know there are trade-offs in my country. I know there are going to be people hurt by this policy. I know there are going to be people going to be helped. How much am I going to raise that tariff to help the ones who are helped? But then how much am I going to be hurting? And there are the marginal benefits of the tariff. And I'm just imagining that, yeah, for a little bit of redistribution toward the workers in the aluminum sector, maybe we like that. And here's the marginal costs. And these marginal costs are just these deadweight losses. No one likes those. And they start out at 0, because under free trade, there's no cost. And then they start to rise because these two triangles, which becomes this triangle, get bigger and bigger. And until eventually, if I close my trade completely, they'd be the whole triangle. All right, so where the marginal cost equal the marginal benefit, that's the price that I would choose. And there's the tariff I would announce. There's my aluminum tariff for the small country. Okay, key point is that everything I've said here is all about the costs and benefits that are bottled up in my country. Nothing is about the costs that are being imposed on foreigners, because there is no cost being imposed on foreigners if I'm that small of a country. None of these exporters care about my market. They can sell whatever they want at the going price, except for this crumb that I am in terms of demand, and they don't care what I do. If they don't care what I do, then I'm facing all of the costs in my country of my trade choice, my policy choice, and I'm facing all the benefits, and I'm going to make the internationally efficient choice. If I want protection, it's because my citizens said, you know what, we're willing to pay more for our beer in order to help these guys in Kentucky, and that's our choice. Another country might say, no, why would we ever do that? These guys can move. We're not willing to pay more for our beer. We like our beer. We like it cheap. Maybe that's Canada. In any case, different countries are going to make different choices. Those choices are going to be, because we're not imposing any externalities on the rest of the world, those policy choices are going to be internationally efficient. In a world of small countries, given the national government objectives, given whatever the trade-offs are that our governments are facing, well, if there's no international inefficiency, there can't be a trade agreement that's mutually beneficial. Because now just think of it as, we've got this pie to split, and if the pie is a fixed size, there's no way that you and I can bargain over, do I get more than half and you get less, or you get less than half and I get more. On the other hand, if there's an inefficiency, we get together, we can actually make the pie bigger and all be better off. We need to find an inefficiency of the unilateral decisions the countries are making. Otherwise, economists would say, you shouldn't have a trade agreement. It's crazy. You're just giving up sovereignty because you're negotiating things that don't generate any surplus, don't generate any benefit. So a key thing is we need to find a reason why there'd be an international inefficiency given the choices that are being made. All right, large country, that's where the reason is. Okay, so now let me think about a large country's unilateral tariff choice. And now we'll think more like the US. And so far, I've just redrawn the picture that we have for the small country. Right? They just take the prices of aluminum from the world as given, and all the costs and benefits are bottled up in US citizens. And if you want to impose costs on consumers to help your producers, fine, do it. There's what a large country looks like. The export-supply curve of foreign exporters, EU, Canada, other countries exporting, China, exporting aluminum to the US, is an upward sloping line. And what does that mean? That means that these countries would be, if we had a tariff imposed on us as the EU exporters, we would be willing to lower our price in order to maintain some market share in the US, because the US is an important market. So when that customs official says 10% duty, the foreign exporter, the EU exporter might say, okay, I was going to sell at $10 a roll. I'm now going to reduce my sale to $9.50. That means the importer will have to pay the extra 50 cents when it comes over, but the exporter has paid some of the duty. That's an externalization of the impact of the tariff on the rest of the world. The tariff revenue is now being collected from foreign exporters. That's this stuff here. And what does that do? Well, remember, here was our careful calculation. If we were a small country, we want this tariff here with a marginal cost to marginal benefit. All of a sudden, a large country can shift some of the costs of its unilateral tariff choice onto those foreign exporters. That's what the cost curve, the marginal cost curve for large, is shifted down. Well, if it's shifted down and the marginal benefits are still what they are, I'm going to want a higher tariff, and I'm going to want a higher aluminum price than I otherwise would have, because European exporters are paying part of the bill, right? I'm getting some tariff revenue that I can use for infrastructure and other things, and that is reducing the cost to me of actually imposing this policy. Okay, a large country's tariff imposes a negative externality on the world. And then what I mentioned before was the negative externality, that's what is the key here that is going to cause a problem. That's the negative externality. It's right there in the costs that are imposed on foreign exporters. And that means that the tariff choices are going to be internationally inefficient, and in particular, they're going to be too high. We can see that right from here. I don't face all the costs of what I'm doing in the world if I'm big enough to affect foreign exporter prices. If I don't face all the costs, but I do get all the benefits, I'm going to do too much of that thing, and that thing is protection. So fundamentally, protection is going to be too high in a law of the jungle world without any trade agreement. That doesn't mean that when we have a trade agreement, we would actually negotiate the free trade, because remember, I'm allowing myself to value as a small country, value some protection. But what it does mean is we ought to be getting rid of this externality-driven part of the decision. Well, if we can address the inefficiency that I've just identified here, as we come together, US and Europe and Canada, and negotiate our trade policies, we can make the pie bigger, and then we can all gain from that. That's a mutually beneficial agreement, as judged by the member governments, because I'm letting member governments decide how they value that purple, right? I've not imposed anything about assumptions that would say free trade should be what you do. Maybe not, I don't care. I'm going to be able to get a trade agreement that should be member-driven and mutually beneficial. All right, how about a little evidence? If this is correct, if we were to look out there in the data and look at countries that are not members of a trade agreement, so not members of the WTO, we might expect that the steeper the export supply curve that they face, remember that was the thing, the higher should be the tariffs that they're imposing. That's what we just argued. So this is a paper from the American Economic Review from a few years ago that does just that, and it does much more. It runs regressions and does a lot of analysis, but here's just a raw figure for 16 countries that at the time were not WTO members, including China, who joined the WTO in 2001. This data was before 2001. And on the horizontal axis is the median across all the industries. Of course, we have many, many industries in the world. So the median for each country across all their industries of the steepness of the export supply curve they face. So remember, if I'm facing, on average, a really steep export supply curve, then I can collect a lot of stuff from foreign exporters, and I should impose a high tariff. If I face a very flat export supply curve, then I'm like a small country, and I shouldn't be imposing a high tariff for that reason. Well, that's exactly what this picture shows, is these are the flat export supply curve countries, these are the steep export supply curve countries, and this is the average tariff imposed by these countries at their 400 or so industry level. And that positive, strong slope is basically an indication that without being members of the WTO and the law of the jungle, these countries are exercising their ability to impose international externalities on other countries, and their tariffs are too high. Okay, well, remember, I started this. Now we're through the worst of it. So if you stuck this far, it's going to get easier now. I started with saying we've got a key starting point here, and that is the WTO's legitimacy is not built on the case for free trade. Rather, it's built on the case for internalizing negative externalities. So now what I've hopefully shown you is nothing that I've said the last 15 minutes has said anything about the case for free trade. It's all about what are the externalities that countries are imposing on each other. And so the next step we have to do is say, okay, if that's what trade agreements are about, show me that the WTO is well designed to handle that problem. If it is, then, in this world where so many of our institutions, domestic and international, are under fire for, why is this legitimate, et cetera, we have a bedrock. We have a bedrock as economists for saying the WTO has a real legitimacy, and it's not built on the case for free trade, it's built on internalizing negative externalities. If we can show that, then the next question will be, has the world changed to undermine this legitimacy? That'll be our next question. All right, well, is the WTO well designed to serve this purpose? Generally, designing an effective institution to address an international externality is really challenging. Think about climate change and how difficult it is, because that's an international externality. Global carbon, for example. How are we going to design the Paris Accord or various environmental institutions and agreements? How are we going to design them to handle this global externality? Well, what I've just tried to argue to is it's exactly the same problem for trade agreements, except that externality has a very particular form. It's traveling through prices, it's depressing the export prices of foreigners. That's what we need to essentially handle. And we're going to exploit, or in fact the GATT and the WTO exploit that form to establish rules that actually handle this pretty well. Okay, so for a member-driven institution like the WTO, what's important, let's keep in mind, is not so much what policy a country chooses as how it chooses it. And that's really important. That's kind of my second important lesson for right now. When we're reading the headlines about Donald Trump and how he is going about making his choices, that to me is the most disturbing thing about what's going on. Not nearly as disturbing to me as what choice he's making, but the question is how he's making those choices. And that's, that's in essence what we want to ask here is, does the WTO, does it get countries to make their choices in a way that internalizes those negative externalities? If so, then it gets them back to as if they were a small country. And doing that, we know that there would be nothing left for a trade agreement to do. All right, well, there's two pillars of the GATT architecture that I'm going to talk about. One is non-discrimination, the MFN, or Most Favored Nation clause. And that essentially says, if I put a tariff on aluminum and raise it to 10% in the US, I cannot have my tariff for aluminum coming in from the EU be at 20% and aluminum coming in from Canada be at 5%. I've got to have deal with everybody the same way. 10%, if that's what I'm choosing, everyone has to do that. That's the MFN non-discrimination clause. That's a pillar of the WTO. Second is reciprocity. Okay, well, MFN, I'm going to gloss over that, but there's a lot of interesting notions about why MFN would make sense. But the essence of it is, we were talking about a two-country world. In a many-country world, MFN preserves the simplicity of that externality that I was just illustrating. So just think of it that way, that MFN is just a simplifier. If we could have MFN tariffs, then the externality problem is pretty much as simple as it was in our two-country model, even though we have 164 countries. And that, just as a basic economic principle, is if you can simplify this problem down a bit, yeah, that would be nice to have rules that do that. MFN does that. Okay, what about reciprocity? Well, reciprocity is the really interesting one for what we're seeing this week because it defines a measured, proportionate response to a country's trade policy changes by its trading partners that basically keep that country acting like a small country. Okay, so one last time back to the figures. Let's see how that works. So how would reciprocity work? Well, remember, this is the large country's unilateral MFN tariff choice. These are the figures that I had before. And for the large country, trading off the moving surplus between consumers and producers and consumers and tariff revenue, That's this, and then deadweight loss, but then there's this stuff I'm collecting from foreigners. That's the externality. And it was that stuff that shifted the marginal cost of protection down for the large country relative to the small, and led to the large country, like the US, choosing too high a tariff for aluminum relative to what it should do in an efficient international setting. Well, what would happen if another country said, okay, you're going to impose a tariff on aluminum, we're going to impose a tariff on product B, and I don't know, let's call that bourbon. So here's the bourbon, and this is the U.S. exports of bourbon, Mitch McConnell's, Kentucky state favorite export supply, and here's the European import demand for bourbon, and quantity and the price. And what we're going to do as the Europeans is we are going to retaliate in a measured and proportionate way and reduce the imports of your bourbon exactly the same way that you're reducing the imports of our aluminum. And by doing that, we're collecting this tariff revenue from your exporters. And the US is saying, well, the reason that we were doing this, going down to here and moving out to here, was that we were collecting this tariff revenue, and that was our externality that we're imposing on foreigners. But now, foreigners are going to basically take that away from us with a reciprocal action. It's essentially going to undo our ability to impose costs onto foreigners and essentially shift our marginal cost of protection back up to about the level it would have been if we were a small country to begin with, because that's going to cancel with that, essentially. Think of it that way. Okay, well, the large country faces the trade-offs of a small country if countries are responding reciprocally to other countries' unilateral protection. That's the legitimacy of the WTO. A multilateral trade institution built on the pillars of MFN, so it keeps the externality simple, and reciprocity, so it keeps large countries essentially with the incentives to make their choices as if they were small countries and not impose their negative externalities on the rest of the world, should work well to help governments solve the basic problem of a trade agreement. Okay, evidence. Again, let's do the same thing, but let's look at actual tariff cuts that are negotiated in the WTO by those countries that were joining the WTO. When they're joining after the formation of the WTO in 1995, they had to offer up tariff cuts to a bunch of countries. And what this figure does, again taken from an American Economic Review recent article, is say, let's look at the tariff cuts that countries and products that they offered, and let's rank them by very flat export supply curves and very steep export supply curves. And according to the story, if a trade agreement is about getting rid of those parts of your protection that are generated by the fact that you were motivated by imposing externalities on other countries, then when you have a really steep export supply curve, you're imposing big externalities, and you should be offering a big tariff cut. It's efficient for you to cut your tariffs a lot. And that's what this is. This is 0, and this is the percent deviation from the mean concession or tariff cut. So these are tariff cuts that were big when countries joined, and these are tariff cuts that are below the mean. They didn't cut their tariff much at all. Well, these are the products and countries for which the export supply curves that they faced were very flat, and accordingly, they didn't impose much externality on other countries. And what this is suggesting is, yeah, the WTO actually works to get countries to cut their tariffs mostly in the products where they had the ability to impose this big negative externality on the rest of the world. What's left for the negotiated tariffs is all of the domestic reasons why I might want to have a tariff that are all bottled up in my own costs and benefits. Not necessarily free trade. The WTO doesn't necessarily get countries to free trade, but it gets rid of the inefficient part of their tariff, and that's the evidence that I want to suggest. Okay, let's go right to the headlines. Reciprocity. I've been focusing on reciprocity. What about reciprocity in action? Well, we don't have to look far. March 2, a week ago, here's the New York Times. Trump's tariffs prompt global threats of retaliation. So you're reading the papers, you might think, oh my God, trade war, it's over. You know, why am I even going to college? I mean, the whole place is gonna, okay. It's not a trade war, not yet. What are these global threats? Well, let's just read it. It says the European Union detailed a 3-step plan to penalize $3.5 billion worth of American trade, the same amount of European steel and aluminum that the bloc estimates would be harmed by the planned tariffs. That's the reciprocal measured response that the WTO expects other countries could do if a country like the US unilaterally raises its own tariffs. So it goes on, it says it proposed taxing American exports including bourbon, blue jeans, orange juice, cranberries, rice, and motorcycles. The European Union could then bring a case against the United States at the World Trade Organization. So the plan is, if Trump went through, which he did with his tariffs, the EU will immediately bring a case to the World Trade Organization and say these are illegal tariffs. And if the World Trade Organization says yes, those are illegal tariffs, the World Trade Organization will authorize the European Union to respond in a reciprocal way. This is the legal retaliation. So what it says is, at the end of it, a European Union official said that the bloc had been preparing for the announcement for months and that everything was in place for a swift, proportionate response. Why is that not a trade war? Seems like a trade war, not a trade war. Why? Because this is a proportionate, not out of control response. It is a measured response that is in equal proportion to the volume that the US is doing. That's very different than a trade war, which would be an uncontrolled, forget it, we're slamming you with all the tariffs we can, okay? And that's exactly what we have in this picture, right? The proportional response by its trading partners, well, there's the bourbon, and basically by cutting the bourbon imports by essentially the same volume as the US is cutting the aluminum imports, you're getting exactly the reciprocity impact that the WTO says you ought to do, and that our model or our theory would say that should basically face the US with the right incentives to do the right thing. Maybe at the end of the day, the US will still stay with these tariffs because even though it can't impose costs and benefit from imposing costs on the rest of the world through the reciprocal action, maybe it will say it's still in our interest to do this. But then it's making the choice for its own country without making the choice because it's not paying all the costs. It's facing the costs of its own decisions. So the large country would face the trade-offs of a small country. Like a small country, it can't reduce the cost to its citizens of its tariff choice by shifting some of those costs onto foreign companies. That's what the EU threatened retaliation is doing. It's serving that purpose. Okay, so the WTO legal threats of reciprocal retaliation, they're converting an attempted unilateral tariff action into a linked reciprocal tariff action, and they're having the intended effect. So here's a March 6th statement from the news analysis. In a sharply worded letter on Tuesday to Mr. Trump, Mr. Hatch said that the proposed tariffs would be paid by American manufacturers and consumers, not foreign companies. That's exactly what you want. If we want to have these tariffs, it's because we're paying for them and we are agreeing that we should redistribute from our own citizens, from consumers of aluminum to those producers of aluminum. And we shouldn't be doing it partly because foreign companies are paying to help us do it. So that's the incentive that we would want in a trade agreement. And that's not yet a trade war. It's really the way the system works. So that's the second thing to keep in mind is as we listen and read and see what's going on, don't panic, because this is exactly the way that the WTO would ultimately bring Trump and the US into line and hopefully get them to make choices that are in the interests of them without imposing costs on the rest of the world. What does a trade war look like? Well, unfortunately, March 3rd, we got a little snippet of that. Here's what it looks like. President Trump warned on Saturday that he would apply higher taxes on imported European cars if the European carried through on its threat to retaliate against his proposed stiff new tariffs on steel and aluminum. Okay, so that would exactly be the beginning of the end of the World Trade Organization, because the European Union is not threatening an illegal retaliation. They're saying we're going to go through the courts and we're going to reciprocate. And Trump is now suggesting that if they did that, he would fly off and retaliate against them again. That would be the start of a real trade war. And so if you see that coming, which we probably won't see for a year. It takes time for these legal processes to go through. But if President Trump does not abide by the WTO rulings and tries to threaten, then we've got a real ending, or at least the beginning of the end of the world trading system as we know it. Okay, that's reciprocity and MFN. That's what I would say is 2/3 of the legitimacy of the world trading system. This is an institution that is set up in a way that we can examine and say it's actually a very smart system. It solves a problem that we can identify and say the world ought to support that, and you don't have to be a free trader to support it. Nothing I've said is anything relying on any argument for free trade being the right policy that countries would go to. Okay, well, what about shallow versus deep? That was the other thing that I mentioned, is that we've also got the movement toward deep integration. Externalities lead to inefficient choices. Cross-border policy externalities lead to internationally inefficient policies. That's the basics that we started with here. And GATT's principal purpose is then to reduce tariffs and expand market access, that is basically trade volume, to levels that internalize the negative externalities that large countries impose on one another under their law of the jungle trade policies. That's a summary of how trade economists typically view how the WTO works. But economics implies something else that's really kind of surprising and crucial, and that is under the law of the jungle policies, if we were just had no WTO, only the trade policies would be distorted, only the tariffs and the border measures. The domestic policies, there's no reason that countries would have distorted their standards and regulations. And that's really important because if you were thinking about in 1947 when the GATT was formed, what was the problem that they saw? They didn't perceive building codes and labor standards and whatever other regulations as the distorted things. They perceived high tariff barriers and quotas. And according to this view of trade agreements, that's exactly what was the problem. Well, that means that there's a basis for shallow integration that is really legitimized as well, which is, okay, if you can have an institution that agrees to lower the tariffs, countries agree to negotiate their tariffs, and then you just have some rules that make sure that they don't introduce distortions into their domestic policies, and that's what a lot of the rules of the WTO can be understood as, then you could achieve international efficiency. And that's the logic of GATT-WTO shallow integration. So I know that's fast. I'm just running out of time, so I'm going to leave that. But the bottom line is shallow integration, which might be the best hope that we as a world have for avoiding the worst conflicts between globalization and sovereignty, there's a real basis for it. And we shouldn't lightly say, oh no, we need to negotiate deep integration because, of course, everything's messed up in policies. There's a basis, and the GATT, I think, is well designed in some sense to articulate it. There's a basis for shallow integration. It's not necessarily a pipe dream. All right, what about the Trump administration? What's their vision for the global trade order? Wilbur Ross said it well, the U.S. Secretary of Commerce. An ideal global trading system would facilitate adoption of the lowest possible level of tariffs. In this ideal system, countries with the lowest tariffs would apply reciprocal tariffs to those with the highest. Okay, reciprocity's great, except if we read on, we say, wait a minute, reciprocal tariffs to those with the highest, and then automatically lower that reciprocal tariff as other countries lower theirs. This leveling technique could be applied product by product or across the board on an aggregated basis. Such a modification would motivate high tariff countries to reduce their tariffs on imports. So wait a minute, what he's saying is we're going to match tariff by tariff. If the EU has a 10% tariff on cars, we're going to raise our tariff to 10%. That's his version of reciprocity. And if Canada has a 2% tariff on cars, we'll match you at 2%. We're not going to mess around with MFN anymore. We're just going to do everything on a level reciprocal basis and level the playing field. That's what he wants to do. Maybe it would achieve reciprocal free trade if we can bargain down everybody to free trade, according to Wilbur Ross's view, but it's certainly about leveling the playing field. We're going to match. And what is the means of the purpose, according to Wilbur Ross and Trump? Abandon MFN, definitely, and we want reciprocity in tariff levels. And in case you doubt this, here's Donald Trump's tweet from March 2. He says, when a country taxes our products coming in at, say, 50%, and we tax the same product coming into our country at 0, not fair or smart. We will soon be starting reciprocal taxes so that we will charge the same thing as they charge us. Okay, that's the vision of Donald Trump, which is really repeal and replace. It is essentially a view of the global trade order that says, we don't want it. We're going to abandon MFN. That's the logical statement. In fact, he's already said that. And we're going to emphasize a form of reciprocity that's nowhere found in the GATT WTO. That form of reciprocity is not there. That's not member-driven. That is nothing like the WTO. And Wilbur Ross appears unhappy with shallow integration as well. He's talking about maybe deeper integration. Okay, so now we have to ask the question: why is this happening? Why is Donald Trump doing this? And here's what I want to suggest, that this is actually maybe bigger than Donald Trump. So, whose interests does the WTO serve? Well, under MFN and reciprocity, as I've tried to argue, the WTO is a rules-based multilateral system, and it serves the interests of the member governments. But those rules do blunt the power of large dominant countries. So first of all, MFN says, boy, I can't threaten Canada with a really, really high tariff of 50% unless I also am threatening the EU, because I have to have the same tariff for the Canada and the EU. But, and so MFN is blunting my power against a smaller country like Canada. Reciprocity, similarly, because we know that reciprocity is the way that we basically turn large countries into small countries. So the question is, why would powerful countries submit to those rules? Well, if a country is sufficiently dominant, other countries might not even be willing to participate in trade negotiations with it. And a great example of that is your own Judge Bowker, who back in the US-Canada Free Trade Agreement negotiations made an argument that with a large country like the US, Canada could actually be hurt by the negotiations because the US was going to hold Canada up at the bargain, and Canada should just not even begin to negotiate in a room with, without rules with the US. And if that's the case, it can be in a country's interest to commit to some rules so that other countries will actually come to play with it in the playground. But if a country's dominance starts to wane, then its support for the WTO rules-based system could actually rationally erode. It doesn't need these rules to convince other countries that it's not going to beat them up because it's not so dominant anymore, and they don't have to worry that it's going to beat them up mercilessly. And it could be in a country's interest to depart from these rules. Well, this didn't actually start with Trump. In the US, there's been undermining of the WTO for a decade or more, and even in the Obama administration, there were issues with the WTO courts that were being held up by the US. So I would say, Trump has definitely accelerated this, and he's made it into a reality show. But I think there's something bigger going on, and that is that the dominance of the US as the reigning hegemon that in 1947 helped create this system, and for 70 years the system has done well. The WTO may need a new hegemon to support it, and the US may not be that hegemon anymore, and that's exactly this picture. Where the U.S. and the EU, they are not the dominant trading or dominant countries anymore. It's the emerging markets and developing countries, and perhaps we're going to need to wait. Well, so first of all, it's about something much bigger than Trump. That's my point. It's not about Trump. It's about something much bigger than Trump. And is multilateralism dead? Well, if the diagnosis is correct, we may be entering a period where the decline in the support for multilateralism is happening, and it's going to happen until that support comes from other quarters. It's not dead, I don't think. I think it may be going into hibernation. It's certainly worth trying to save, for the reasons that I've suggested, that it is a legitimate, very legitimate institution, but it may be on the respirator and need real help, and the U.S. may not be the one that can lead us out of there. And like I said, the shallow integration approach, well, it's our best hope of avoiding the kinds of sovereignty and globalization confrontations. And for that reason alone, if we can support this approach, I think there are huge benefits. Could China be the next hegemon? Doesn't look like it right now, the way they're behaving, perhaps. But as they grow in dominance, they may find it in their interest, just as the US did, and perhaps other countries, the UK in a previous generation, find it in their interest to commit to these multilateral rules in a hegemonic way. Okay, so let me conclude, because Scott tells me it's done. There is a caveat about offshoring. I didn't have time to get to it. I didn't think I would. I'll post the slides. They go through it. And for those of you who are interested, you can see. But the bottom line is, the caveat to offshoring is a caveat, but it doesn't change the fundamental point that I think the WTO as an institution deserves as much support as we can give it. And the hope is that we can keep calm and carry on. And that's my advice for Canada and for all of us, in fact.
Okay, so we have a couple of mics that we're going to get from the back there. Actually, they're at the back, Rob. And we're going to open it up to questions. So until we get the mics, anybody who wants to ask a question, just raise your hand. See if that one works.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Good. I'll let you manage it, Bob.
Hi. Could you just say a little more about the need for the hegemon? I mean, it sounded to me like if we didn't have a hegemon, then we'd all be sort of small, medium-sized countries. Wouldn't it just more naturally flow the way you outlined it to begin with?
Yeah, it's a good question. And so it's a bit of a subtle point, and the way to think of it is if I am a hegemon that is asymmetric enough and powerful enough, other countries are sufficiently small that they would be worried that if I got them in a room without rules, I would negotiate with them in a way that would actually make it not worth their while to negotiate. And so we start from a point where, with a very, very dominant country, that country might say, well, in order to get things going, I'm going to have to pre-commit to some rules. So then I commit to a world trading system that has, say, MFN. So they say, look, don't worry, I'm not going to hurt you because I'd have to hurt everybody. I'm committing to MFN, and then reciprocity and all that. And then as that hegemon starts to decline, there'll be a point when I, as a hegemon, could think of other countries and say, you know what, even without these rules, you would now come and bargain with me because you know that I wouldn't beat you up too much, but I would actually do better without the rules than I could with these rules that basically took all my bargaining power away. And so you get into this middle ground where there's no really dominant country, and then there's no real support for these rules, and you need an emerging country to become so dominant again that it becomes a supporter. And that's the idea. You know, as I said at the beginning of the talk, I wanted to try to kind of bring some broader thought than the immediate headlines of it's all Donald Trump, because you know he would like us to think that, but I want to think no, it's not necessarily all him. And this is a view that you know, I think it's an interesting one, and whether it's really true is a question for lots of research and empirical work. But I think it's perhaps got some elements of truth in it.
Hi. Doesn't the WTO have any dispute resolution mechanism which is enforceable? Or like, are we observing the lack of this as well, in addition to any other, like looking for a new support? Because what if like we do have an emerging country supporting the WTO, but then the same story gets repeated where a larger dominant country gets to reject the WTO resolution? So.
Yeah, so I think the question of how the rules of the WTO are enforced is a great one. And again, for those of you who are students who might want to be working on honors theses or faculty or whatever, the WTO is a really interesting institution in many ways. And one of those is it is a self-enforcing institution that has no police power. There's no external ability to enforce anything. So the only way that it can really enforce things is if those parties to the WTO find it in their interest to do what it says. And so far, when you look at the WTO legal rulings, it's got a very good record of getting countries to do what it says to do. And a great example, very relevant for today, is in the first Bush administration in the US, a steel tariff was imposed, safeguard steel tariff, and it was done also in ultimately what was viewed as a WTO illegal way. It wasn't as extreme as what we're seeing this week. It didn't have all the reality TV show aspects, but it was in a more subtle way an illegal US act. And Europe responded by bringing a case against the WTO. And it took about a year and a few months for the case to go through, but ultimately the WTO said, yes, US, you have violated your commitment by imposing these steel tariffs, and to bring yourself back into compliance, you should take those steel tariffs off. And the US did it. Bush took those tariffs off. And why? Because if the US didn't do it, the WTO would have authorized the EU to counter-retaliate in a reciprocal way. And essentially, the US said, well, if we've got to pay all the costs because now we're having a reciprocal cost on our exporters just like we're imposing on theirs, we're doing the calculation and we don't want to do this. So they took it off. So that's a good, very relevant example for today that's how the WTO works. It authorizes retaliation of trading partners in the hope that will make a country see, these are the costs you're imposing on others. Do you really want to do this? And often when countries see that, they say, you're right, we don't want to do that. Now the worry is what Trump has threatened, which is if the EU does that and says, okay, we're going to retaliate against you because the WTO told us we could, and if then Trump says, no, you're not. If you do that, I'm going to raise car tariffs on you. That's when you would see the whole system fall apart. And from the point of view of a self-enforcing agreement, there's basically an off-equilibrium threat. Off-equilibrium meaning we haven't seen it in the history of the GATT, WTO, which is the whole system could fall apart. And if the whole system falls apart, everybody will really pay a high price, including the US. And that, so far, has been keeping countries obeying the rules, because they know that if they really messed it up, it would just be horrible for everybody. That's the hope, is that we will continue to do that. But the question is, with these kind of threats that Trump's making, he's explicitly making threats that suggest he doesn't want to. Now, Trump is somebody who seems to put lots of threats out there and doesn't necessarily mean a lot of them. So that's where I think, keep calm and carry on is probably the right way to view things for now. Keep working in your classes and raising your kids, and don't worry that hopefully the world's not going to end tomorrow. But there are these thoughts.
Hello. You showed a graph with China having high tariffs, and even though it wasn't in the right position to do so, is that a correct interpretation of that graph?
Yeah, so it was not on the regression line, you're right. So China actually, kind of interestingly, for the export supply curves that it faces, it had higher tariffs than it should have. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right.
And do you think that was necessary, that pre-2001 condition of high tariffs? Was that necessary to create that China miracle that we witnessed in the past decade?
It's a great question. That's a really great question. And that is That would be one interpretation of a picture like that, is that, well, you know, China has really managed for several decades to do an amazing growth miracle. There have been other growth miracles, but China, you know, by far the biggest. And the question is, what are the policies that are enabling them to do that? Could it be protective policies and other things? Possibly. And maybe that picture is, you know, is kind of suggestive of that. But at the end of the day, that is in some sense why you know, I believe that the WTO, being a member-driven institution, it doesn't force countries to adopt policies that say Washington thinks they should. It doesn't force countries to adopt free trade. It's all what countries want to bargain. And so China's tariffs right now are, on average, about 12% across manufacturing products. You know, U.S. tariffs are more like 3%, so there's an asymmetry. India's tariffs are much, much higher. China actually, when it joined the WTO, did cut its tariffs quite a bit in response to the negotiations. But there is definitely an asymmetry that many of the developing and emerging countries have much higher tariffs than the industrialized countries. And you know, the WTO can't and doesn't force them to lower those tariffs. So to the extent that they feel that these tariffs are important for our development process, that's what a member-driven institution like the WTO honors. It says, that's fine. What we're here is to get rid of the tariffs that are put on for inefficient purposes because you're not paying the full cost. That's what I think the negotiations actually get rid of. And what's left then is what the country feels is it should be its policies. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Do you think there's any reasonable grounds for the Trump administration to be concerned about the size of the trade deficit?
Great question. And so answer, the Trump administration is really concerned about the size of bilateral trade deficits in particular. And there, I would say no. It just seems really hard to justify on any grounds. And partly, I think it's important to keep in mind that, you know, multilateral trade deficit, or the current account, that has a meaning, because if I have a current account deficit, I'm borrowing from the rest of the world, and we may decide, well, we shouldn't be borrowing so much from the rest of the world, or maybe we should be lending to the rest of the world. So you might arguably say, you know, I worry about multilateral deficits, and then the question is, are trade policies a sensible way to think about multilateral deficits? And answer usually would be probably not, because if you're borrowing from the rest of the world, those are really more macroeconomic issues, and shouldn't you be using things that affect savings and investment, and tariffs are not typically what we think of as an instrument for doing that. But that's all about the multilateral deficit. When you come to a bilateral deficit, that has essentially no meaning in economics. And if I have, as the U.S. runs a trade surplus with Canada and it runs a trade deficit with Mexico, you know, what does that mean? It just means that there's some triangular trade going on, but that doesn't mean that it has any impact on the U.S. multilateral deficit. And in fact, to the extent that the U.S. multilateral deficit is determined by things like the big tax cuts we've just done, which are adding to the budget deficit, or potentially will, the infrastructure projects, which will probably add to the deficit, to the extent that those things are going to keep us needing to borrow from the rest of the world, if I were to go after somebody's bilateral deficit, it's like a game of whack-a-mole. It's going to come up somewhere else, because if I don't do anything to affect the multilateral, you know, it's by definition, I can't have any effect on the, by hitting one. So, bottom line, I think it's really difficult to make any sense of it. And I agree that both Trump and Wilbur Ross are totally fixated on bilateral deficits. And Trump is very, as he is in many things, you know, reality TV show, very explicit about saying, we're losers with this country because we're running a trade deficit with them. And that means our trade deficit's bad, our trade agreement is bad. We're winners with this country because we're running a trade surplus with them. And that's seems to be his organizing principle, which is pretty hard to rationalize.
I found the description of MFN very interesting in that how does the WTO reconcile that with trade agreements that involve only a number of countries, and with the US now exempting Canada and Mexico from the tariffs that they're implementing, can they really use the idea of NAFTA as an excuse to prevent the EU from taking that to the WTO?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the exceptions, one of the key exceptions in the WTO to the MFN principle, which is a principle unless there's a specific carve out for discriminatory tariffs, is for free trade agreements. And so there's a so-called Article 24, which is one of the rules of the WTO, which allows countries to discriminate by negotiating free trade agreements. So I can, as the US and Canada and Mexico did NAFTA, and the EU has its free trade among EU members. And so there is a carve out from the from the non-discriminatory principle, and to some degree, the growth of the free trade agreements, now there's some 400 of them. Back in 1990, there were very few. There was the US-Canada, and there was the EC. But since 1990, we've had an explosive growth in preferential agreements. And I think that is maybe part of this erosion of the multilateral system, because in the idea of this carve-out originally in the GATT was this should be pretty special. Like, the European community should be able to do it because we're hoping that by integrating together these war-torn countries from World War II won't fight again, right? Germany and France, that was the idea. And so we should allow countries to form a very integrated unit. And so for many decades, there weren't many free trade agreement activities. But subsequent to 1990, when the US started doing it, other countries started doing much more, and the EC grew into the EU and expanded. And so that, I think, the growth of the preferential agreements is part of this potential erosion that could be because of the loss of a hegemon to the world trading system. That said, I think it's really interesting and sad, as Trump would say in his tweets, that what Trump has done so far on the NAFTA carve-out is you could interpret it as kind of a clever bargaining strategy. And what he did, he clearly does not want to be bound by WTO rulings when he's negotiating with a country. And when he's negotiating with Mexico and Canada, he would like nothing better than to be able to threaten that if you don't agree at the table, we're going to slam you with tariffs you've never seen before. Right now, if he honors his WTO commitments, the worst he could do is say, well, now we're going to slam you with our MFN tariffs that we offer everybody else. And those are very low. And that's, he's chafing at that. So if you think about what he has just done with the steel and aluminum, he has basically said, we're going to break our WTO bindings on steel and aluminum by raising the steel tariff to 25% and the aluminum tariff to 10%. And probably we know that the WTO is going to find him illegal. But we're going to do this now because ultimately I don't care so much about the WTO, according to Trump. And then we're going to say to Mexico and Canada, okay, we're going to exempt you for now, and conditional on a good NAFTA negotiation with us, we're going to permanently exempt you. But if you don't do what we want, your steel tariff's going up to 25%, not 2%, which is what the MFN tariffs would have been. So one way to think about what he has just done this week is a very bad thing for Canada and Mexico, and kind of revealing of Trump's, I think, Trump's approach. He wants bargaining power. He doesn't want to be restricted by a rules-based system like the WTO. He sees these MFN restrictions as getting in his way of isolating a country and really threatening, and he's going to find ways to basically unleash himself from those commitments. So that's a bad thing. Now, hopefully, like I said, we can never tell what Trump is really up to. He says one thing, but then a month later he's doing something else, and it could be that at the end of the day everything's working out. But certainly, I see that as a troubling thing. Yeah.
We can take one more question.
Hi, I was wondering what types of countries typically advocate for deep integration as opposed to shallow, and like what's the reasoning behind that?
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the pieces of evidence that kind of suggests that that offshoring and supply chains may be changing the problems that countries deal with in trade agreements is that often the countries that are negotiating very deep trade negotiations are the ones that are involved in supply chains. So countries that are involved in the supply chains and the inputs are moving from one country to another and finally being assembled in a fourth or fifth country. In order to do those supply chains, often there's foreign investment that needs to be there. There's technology that has to be transferred to a country from another country. And so countries have come of the view that in order to set up these supply chains, we need to harmonize regulations, we need to harmonize intellectual property rights protection so that we can kind of use this whole set of countries in our supply chain as one continuous factory floor, that we can have things move seamlessly from one factory to another across borders. And so to a large degree, the countries that are actively negotiating these very deep agreements are the ones that are also actively involved in a supply chain with the other countries. And as I said, one interpretation of that is, well, the way that the externalities are now being imposed on countries when they organize these supply chains is very different than the way that the externalities were imposed in the days of the 1900s and early 2000s, and that may be changing what we need in a trade agreement. And if so, then it may be that the trade-offs between sovereignty and globalization are really more inevitable. And that's a really interesting question, and one that empirically and theoretically has only just been touched on by the economics literature. Certainly I don't know the answer, but it's a great research question, and it's a conjecture that may be partly what's happening.
And we'll be discussing that in my trade class next year. I'm short of students, but I think it's time to wrap it up. And just join me in thanking Professor Staiger for a great talk.